Welcome to Fridays with a Forester. My name is Gary Wyatt, and today is March 31st. Foraging for wild edibles is our topic today. Again, my name is Gary Wyatt, Extension Educator with the University of Minnesota Extension in Forestry, based out of our Mankato Regional Office. Lauren Beckus is Regional Support Staff at Andover, and she'll be also hosting our webinar today. Our topic today is foraging for wild edibles. Jeff Jackson, our extension educator in forestry in Duluth, is our speaker for today's topic. Few Zoom details. We want you to ask questions in the Q&A, please. You won't have access to your voice and video. And there, I guess the chat is also available. So Lauren and I will be monitoring the Q&A and chat at the end of Jeff's presentation. And we'll try and end at 10 o'clock, but we can go over if there's more questions. And again, we are recording these webinars and they'll be available on our Z link, z.umn.edu/Fridays. Jeff, I'm going to stop sharing and you can begin.
Well, thanks for the introduction, Gary. Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Lauren and Gary, for hosting this and for the introduction. My name is Jeff Jackson. I'm an extension educator with the University of Minnesota, and I'm based in Duluth. And I've been enjoying wild edibles ever since I was in elementary school. So my father, John Jackson, was a botanist. He's a retired educator, and that's when he began to teach me about foraging for wild edibles. So I am really excited to be here with you today, and we're going to be talking about foraging in Minnesota woodlands and in your own backyard. So my goal in today's presentation is to give you a small taste, pun intended, of many possible plants that can be foraged and gathered in Minnesota, as well as we'll be sharing some resources to help you learn more and to be safe. And I do want to say we will be sending out a PDF of these slides to everybody after the presentation. So there's a lot of information we're going to be covering, but don't feel like you've got to capture everything taking notes. We will be sending a copy of the slides out. So here's the outline for today's presentation. We'll be talking about wild harvest, focusing on forests and woodlands. Then we'll switch over to talking about things that you might find closer to home, a wild harvest and a home landscape. And then we'll wrap it up talking about resources to help you grow in your ability to forage for wild edibles. So beginning to talk about a woodland setting, the number one rule of wild foraging is it must be done safely and sustainably. And we'll talk about what both of those words mean. So safety and foraging, tell someone where you're going, when you'll return. If you could find a buddy to go out and forage with, that's even that much better. Know the area where you will be foraging. Has it been sprayed with herbicide? If this area is new to you, get a map, learn more about the area. And in a few slides, we'll be talking more about getting permission and permits if those are needed. It's good to go out earlier in the day, but in case you're out later than you think you might be, take a flashlight and cell phone with you. And then just bring safety equipment, pack for the weather. We know how quickly the weather could change here in Minnesota. So make sure that you've got clothing for rain if that would happen, or any other changes in the weather. Some basic rules of wild food foraging, and we'll be talking a lot about these today. Collect only what you can positively identify as edible. Only collect the part of the plant that you're sure is edible. And we'll be talking about a few plants today where part of the plant is edible, perhaps the berry, other parts are toxic. So make sure you're collecting that edible part. Harvest only healthy plants, clean them thoroughly, properly prepare them. For instance, mushrooms, you always want to cook a mushroom. Eat small quantities when first trying a wild edible plant. Just try it out, see how your system handles it. And then sustainability, don't over-harvest. Take only what you can use. Kind of a rule of thumb would be to leave 80% or more of what you find in a given area to make sure that it can continue to reproduce and spread there. So here's the 5 steps of identifying edible wild plants. First, make a tentative identification. Never identify a plant by one single characteristic. Make careful observations about key characteristics. And then what you'll do is you'll compare that to the reliable references that you have with you. So use both the written description and the illustration or photographs to confirm your finding. And it's really a good idea to compare it to several reliable references. Make sure that you're not mentally forcing the plant that you're looking at to fit that description. Locate more. You will find differences from plant to plant in how they appear. So find more than one, gather more specimens until you can effortlessly recognize the plant. And then lastly, assess your confidence. Are you really sure? Under no circumstances should you ever try to taste or eat any part of an unidentified plant. A new tool that I wanted to mention is using Facebook groups to help you identify edible wild plants. And at about the middle of the slide, I've listed 2 of the groups that I'm a member of. Now, I would say don't rely on this for identification, but these groups really can be helpful. There are experts on these groups that are willing to review. The key is you need to post high quality photos showing plant features. I've seen people post photos of plants, taken from 4 feet away, not showing any identifiable features. And that's not going to be helpful for the experts. But if you really post some high quality photos, they can provide feedback. Really, the main thing I use this for is it helps me to know the timing of when edibles may be ready to collect. So when I can see that morels are ready in about the middle of the state, then I know in the next week or 2, they'll be ready in northern Minnesota. So I found these groups are fun and very helpful. This slide was taken from a presentation by James Burnham with the Minnesota DNR. It's talking about the different rules you're going to find for being on Minnesota DNR lands versus other types of public lands. But for instance, state natural areas, there's no foraging allowed. But at state parks and state forests, you can harvest berries, mushrooms for personal use. Now, the rules get quite a bit different when you go on to national lands, national parks, national forests. So it's really important to check the rules and find out if you're needing permits when you begin to forage on public lands. All right, now we're getting to the fun part. We're going to be talking about some of the actual plants out there that you'll be able to find on your own. And we'll start with 3 that are, I know is everybody tired of the winter? I think we all are. These 3 will be ready fairly soon. Spring is coming. So the first is leeks or ramps, wild onions. This goes by a few different names. Early spring edible, it really does taste like an onion. This one is pretty easy to identify, definitely by the smell. It's got an onion-like smell. Some people will just cut the leaves. Other people will dig them up and harvest the roots too, like a green onion. This is one that you'll be tempted to take a lot of it, so you need to harvest this one sustainably. Another spring one is ostrich fern fiddleheads, and you can see in the middle of the screen here, this is what the fiddlehead looks like. And what that is in the spring, as that's coming out of the ground, those are that tightly furled fronds of the ostrich fern that will unfurl and turn into the fern leaf that you're used to looking at. I had looked for these for years and was not able to find them. Finally, last year, I found these on a trout fishing trip over in northern Wisconsin, and fried in butter, they are delicious. They really do taste a lot like asparagus. Another spring edible is the morel mushroom. That has a very distinct sponge-like head. It's a very tasty mushroom. So when you learn more about foraging for mushrooms, there's about 5 to 7 mushrooms that are fairly safe, and they will be listed in the different references as fairly safe mushrooms to harvest. But I always advise caution with mushrooms, because even with some of these safe ones, there will be lookalikes. There is a false morel that does look quite a bit like the morel mushroom. So you still want to be very, very sure of your identification on this. So moving on, so we're going beyond just the spring edibles in woodlands to chicken of the woods. And this is another mushroom. And all mushrooms do need to be cooked before being consumed. This one really does taste like chicken. And if you can find this one before it's overripe, it is really a tasty mushroom. Some people will shred it and then substitute it for chicken in vegetarian type dishes. Some people do have a mild reaction to this. So as with any wild edible, the first time you try it, try a small amount, just see how your body reacts to it. Chanterelle mushrooms are another one of those. If you see a list of 7 safer mushrooms, this will be on the list. You'll find this in both hardwood and conifer forests. And again, this one does have 3 lookalikes. We've listed them here, which can cause a severe gastric upset. So make sure of your identification on this one too. So chaga on birch, this is a mushroom. You'll see it in the photograph here. It's a very blackish, conch-like looking thing. When you harvest it, so it's going to be found on dead or dying trees. You'll harvest it in the winter. When you knock it off, say safely with a hatchet, you'll find then the interior is kind of this lightish brown color. So you'll want to cut it into chunks, you dry it, and then use it to brew a tea. It's a good tasting tea. There are possible health benefits from this tea, as well as it just tastes good. Blueberries. Who doesn't love blueberries? There are 2 native varieties in the state, and you're going to find those more in the northern part of the state. Find those in forests, also in moist sandy pine or oak barrens. Thimbleberry. This is going to be found, again, more in the northern part of the state, but along trails and damp, rich soils. This one is really tasty. I really do prefer this one to raspberries. So this one can be eaten fresh, made into preserves. Just a little warning, these berries are very soft. They really mush very easily. And so while you're harvesting them, if you pile up more than an inch, you're going to be making preserves because these berries don't hold together well, but really delicious flavor to them. So moving on to serviceberry, Juneberry, or Saskatoon berry. And here I want to just talk a little bit about common names versus Latin names. A lot of these plants will have several common names. I typically call this Juneberry. My coworkers often call it serviceberry. So there can be confusion with common names. And I wouldn't expect most of us to begin to learn to memorize the Latin names, but each of these edible wild plants will only have one Latin name. So where it might help you out, if you're using, say, one reference to identify these plants, and then you're using another reference to tell you if it's edible or not, just make sure the Latin names match. That's how you can be 100% sure that that you're going to be consuming the right plant, the plant that you think it is. Back to June berries. So most counties in the state will have at least one species. There are 8 species in the state. This is a photo. These darling girls are my granddaughters. This was about 2 years ago. In the fall, we were eating June berries by Duluth, and they thought these were so delicious. We couldn't tear them away until they were pretty full on these June berries. So the ripe ones, the dark purple ones, really have a good flavor. Gooseberries. There are 4 native gooseberries in our state that are edible. They're typically not eaten raw, used primarily for jam and jelly. And those will be growing in rich, moist forest, especially by rivers and ponds. Wild raspberries. So really the most commonly eaten wild berries in the state. And there are 3 different kinds that I'm going to be talking about. So there's a black raspberry, red raspberry, and then blackberries, also called Allegheny blackberries in the state. And these will all have compound leaves that typically have 3 leaflets. It can have 5 leaflets, but typically 3. And they all have these sharp bristles or curved thorns on them. But very commonly eaten wild edible in our state. Hazelnuts. So we have both American and beaked hazelnuts in the state, depending on where you live in the state. On the left here, we've got a photograph of the fruit of the American hazelnut. On the right is the beaked hazelnut. And I've heard the American is preferred just because the nut is larger. But if you're in a part of the state like I am, where all you have is the beaked hazelnuts, those are good too. You do need to find these before the animals find them when they ripen in the fall, because squirrels and deer just love these. And so there's a very narrow window after they turn ripe to eat these before the animals get them. So wild grapes, what you'll see with the wild grape is the fruit will be smaller than it is on a cultivated grape. But these make wonderful pies, juices, wines, and jams. In the early summer, the full-size but still tender leaves can also be preserved for later use. But like with many of our wild edibles, there are toxic lookalikes. I've got a photograph of the fruit of just one of these 3 lookalikes. It's called Virginia creeper. And you can tell how similar it looks like. But there's, again, find a good reference and learn the identifying characteristics. And after you've found this a few times, you'll be confident of your identification. Yeah, and I do want to, we're going to hold all the questions until the Q&A time, but please continue to post your comments and questions. Would love to hear about some of your experiences with some of these plants. And now we're going to turn our attention more to more of a home landscape and the wild edibles that you can find there. So some tips: being knowledgeable about the area that you've selected for harvesting. And again, who is it owned by? The federal government, county, state, or private person? And make sure that you've got the proper permits, or if it's private land, make sure that you've talked to the landowners and gotten permission to harvest there. So you will want to know if herbicides or pesticides have been applied there and stay away from those if they have been. And that's the reason you'd want to avoid farming fields and ditches because of herbicide, pesticide application. You'll want to avoid roadside ditches for the same reason, but also wild parsnips, especially in the southern part of the state. If you get the sap of that on your skin, it's really a severe beyond skin irritation. That can be a really severe burn, and that's something to be careful about. Avoid areas where dogs have been, and avoid areas with excess pollution. So moving on then to some of these pretty common plants, dandelions, European native. The roots really have a pleasant taste. I really like it. I have struggled though when I've harvested these just to get all the dirt off. And so if anybody has some tips on that, please post that in the Q&A and we can talk about that later. But they do have a really good flavor. Leaves are actually quite nutritious for you. Those can be eaten raw when they're younger. The older ones are going to become more bitter. You probably want to boil those, but quite a few vitamins and minerals in these. Now, the flowers can be eaten raw or dried to be used for tea. Violets, we have over 100 varieties of violets in the state. Typically, people are going to be harvesting the flowers. And those flowers can be used to garnish salads or flavor vinegars and syrups. My dad used to make just a delicious violet syrup that we would put on pancakes that was very tasty. But the young leaves also can be eaten raw in salads and added to soup as a thickener or eaten as a cooked green also. Garlic mustard. So this is one that I have not personally tried. I've heard very good things about the flavor. If you've had experience eating garlic mustard, please let us know in the Q&A. Well, and it was introduced to this country from Europe as a garden herb, and that is because it is quite tasty. So when you harvest this one, please pull up the whole root and remove the whole plant because it is an invasive and we want to discourage the spread of garlic mustard. The leaves then can be added to salads, sauteed as a green. I've heard really good things about making a pesto sauce with the greens. Can also be turned into a cream sauce and soup. Now, daylilies, many parts of the daylily are edible. We are talking here about the common daylily and not Easter lilies. Easter lilies are toxic. And we'll have a link for you in the slides here where you can go to find more information on dining on daylilies. Now, elderberry, this is one of those plants where parts of it are toxic, parts of it are edible. The dark purple berries are a great source of antioxidants, really wonderful flavor. They make a good juice, jelly, and beverage. But the raw seeds, stems, leaves, and roots are toxic. So if you're going to be eating the seeds, those must be cooked to be edible. But from what I've read, say if you are making jelly, the heating process of making the jelly is that's sufficient to cook them so that then the seeds would be edible. Often people use like a cheesecloth to filter out the seeds. The flowers are edible too, and I've read that those white flower bunches can be fried as fritters. Wild rose. The Native Americans made a tea for diarrhea from the roots. So the fruit of the wild rose, which is also called rose hips, are very high in vitamin C. They've got a good flavor. Those can be made into jams, jellies, syrups, and teas. The flowers can be eaten raw or used in teas, jellies, or syrups. This one can be a good emergency food if you're out on a hike or something needing emergency food. Again, the hips are very high in vitamin C. Acorns, this is one I have not personally tried. So again, if you've had experience with acorns, please post something into the chat. But Native Americans use the acorn from the bur oak for making a flour that was often mixed with cornmeal and baked in the form of cakes. So what gives acorns a bitter flavor before they're treated is a substance called tannin. And white oak acorns have less tannin, and so they're less bitter than red or black oak acorns. But either way, you'll want to remove that tannin before processing them by either boiling them in water, or you can do a cold leaching process, which takes a few days, where at cold temperatures, water will remove that tannin. So cattails, one of my favorites. You'll see this photograph of me here eating the spikes, the flower heads. Those are typically ripe around mid-June. Sometimes when you talk about eating cattails, people are thinking of eating the big brown mature cattail full of seeds that you'll find in the fall. But these are actually talking about harvesting these in the spring when they're still green. They're covered by a translucent membrane. You peel back that membrane just like you're peeling corn on the cob, boil them, draw them in butter. Very good. But some people have called cattails the supermarket of the swamp because all parts of it are edible. The stems can be eaten. The flowers in the spring, right after this green stage, the male parts will have a bright yellow pollen, which can be added to pancakes, cookies, and muffins. The roots can be baked like a potato. You'll want to clean and peel those first. Stinging nettles are edible, but they do sting. And so you'll want to wear gloves when you're harvesting these. But the young shoots, as they're coming out of the ground, and then the tender top leaves on the plant are very good as a boiled green. I think they've got a spinach-like flavor, but I like spinach, so I thought it was a good flavor. Native Americans used this in spring when other food plants were scarce. But the young shoots and the young leaves will also make a nourishing tea. Chokecherry, the most widely distributed tree in North America. And with chokecherry, you can eat the fresh fruit, also turn the fruit into jelly or pies. So a warning here, the wilted leaves and fresh seeds do contain cyanide, but cooking will destroy the cyanide, so you do not need to pit the fruit when you're making jelly. The fresh berries are very good to eat. It's just don't eat the seeds on that because they do contain that cyanide. Well, and now we're going to transition. I think we're doing well on time. We're going to transition over to resources. I'm going to talk for about 5-10 more minutes, and then we'll get to our discussion and Q&A time. University of Minnesota has quite a few resources on our website on wild edibles. So again, you'll have all these links in the slides when we send them out, but going to extension.umn.edu, you'll find our information on wild edibles. Minnesota Wildflowers is a fantastic resource for not only wildflower identification, but also they do have a lot of shrubs in here too. They do not have much information on edibility, but great information that they've got on identification, that then you would pair that with another reference that talks about edibility. Explore Minnesota. They've got some information on outdoor foraging across the state, and we'll have that link for you. This has been one of my favorite resources on mushrooms, mushrooms of the upper Midwest. The photographs are just fantastic in here, very clear. They really show identifying characteristics. So this has been one of my personal favorites for mushrooms. You might consider joining the Minnesota Mycological Society. So there are good resources on their website. But if you're really getting serious about mushrooms, they will sponsor mushroom walks across the state where you can go out with a real expert and learn tips for identifying mushrooms. And so if you're interested in mushrooms, would highly recommend learning more. Anytime you see this z.umn.edu, that means it's on the U of M website. But we've got a link to the U.S. Forest Service has a nice handout on identifying, and this is at no charge, identifying mushrooms, and it talks about their edibility too. The Forager's Harvest. I've heard good things about this as a reference. Nature's Garden. Someone on our team just put a plug-in for this book this week. They said it was one of their favorite guides to foraging for edible wild plants. Wild Berries and Fruits of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Another reference book, as well as Midwest Foraging. Believe this book has recipes in it too. You will find some of the books on edible wild plants will not have as many recipes, and that's true of this book, Peterson Field Guides. Again, this is one that I really rely on. It doesn't have recipes in it, but I really like the illustrations for helping to identify edible wild plants. And then How to Eat in the Woods, really a classic in this field by Bradford Angier. And then we'll talk about, the last one we'll talk about is called the Minnesota Harvester Handbook. And this one is available through the University of Minnesota bookstore. We've got a link right here to learn more and to purchase this, but it does talk about wild edibles. And what's fun, that we get into some different topics too, such as holiday decorations that you can harvest on your own. And then non-timber forest products like maple syruping, different saps you can harvest. So yeah, it's a really great reference book to have. U of M Extension will be sponsoring some spring sessions using this book, and Gary's going to tell you more about that in a few minutes. And then I'll kind of wrap it up here with other resources listed on the University of Minnesota website. We've got the Z links for you here that will be in the handout. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Really, thanks for this opportunity, and I'm looking forward to our discussion now.
Thanks, Jeff. I'll let you keep on your slides if you want, if you need to get back to them. I think we'll start with Q&A with Lauren, and you want to start, and then we'll go back and forth, and I'll cover chat.
Perfect. So first question, you keep saying all mushrooms must be cooked. Why is this different than mushrooms that are from the supermarket?
Boy, that is a good question, and I'm gonna ask Gary to fill in on that too, if you know anything more. I'm not sure of what the difference might be, and I agree. I've eaten raw mushrooms from the supermarket, but what I've read, and maybe it's there's a greater potential for, and this is just a guess on my part, but with wild mushrooms, there might be more variability in how they've been grown, and possibility, more of a possibility for, say, bacterial contamination, that type of thing. That's just a guess.
Right. Yeah, I'd say you're right, Jeff. I think most of the produce, the mushrooms that are sold in grocery stores are farm raised in cultures that are managed and in greenhouses and so forth. So they have a strict code of safety, and they're labeled that. So that's why you can have raw mushrooms on your salads and so forth. Yep. Real quickly, back to Jack on the chat. He gives a high thumbs up for thimbleberries. They're also good, and we'll add that to our presentations this spring and fall with our local extension educators. Thimbleberries.
Can I tell just a fun thimbleberry story? So I was at one of our parks in Duluth last fall harvesting thimbleberries, and this car was driving by and it came screeching to a stop. I mean, the brakes were locked up, and a woman came out of the car and she yelled, "Are those thimbleberries?" And I said, "Yes, they are." So the story was, she was married, living in Seattle. Her husband is from the Seattle area, had never tried thimbleberries. They were on vacation in Duluth, and she was just so anxious for him to try thimbleberries because they're so good. And so I made their day. They really enjoyed tasting them there. Thanks.
Super.
This question, I think we kind of answered with the slides, but I'll just kind of go over it again. Are any books you would recommend specifically about edibles in Minnesota and or Western Wisconsin? I don't know if any of your references are specific to that.
Yeah, I don't think it gets quite that granular. I think the books, if we go back to them, they're either for the Eastern United States or they're for the kind of the Midwest. There was the one, let me go back a few slides, which was for a tri-state area. This one was for Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And I think that's about as granular as it'll get. I don't think we'll find them that are just specifically for Minnesota alone, but good question.
Back to chat. Shane mentions garlic mustard wasn't too bad. Focus on younger leaves. If making pesto for the first time, cut it with basil until you get a feel for it. So that's from Shane. Thank you, Shane.
Oh, thank you, Shane. He's one of our extension educators, very knowledgeable with edible wild plants. Thank you, Shane.
There's a couple comments in the Q&A. My grandma used to make dandelion wine. The other comment is garlic mustard is very good. My chickens and tortoise enjoy it as well.
It's fun as we're talking about these edible wild plants, and I talk to people, it brings back good memories for a lot of people, you know, some family traditions and things they had shared maybe with their parents or siblings or grandparents. So thanks for sharing that.
Jenny has another comment on garlic mustard. I have cooked with garlic mustard after collecting a big bag of invasive cleanups. We did pesto, and let's see, but I agree with Shane with the younger leaves. It was also hard to get the dirt off. I usually submerge leaves in a big bowl of water, then remove and strain the leaves and dump the water out, and then repeat it once or twice. Thank you, Jenny.
Yeah, thank you.
Next question. Do you know how potent the cyanide is in choke cherries? Just wondering about juicing and accidentally crushing some of them. The seed part doesn't get through the sieve, but maybe crushing them releases the poison.
Yeah, that's well, so apple seeds, and a common apple seed has a low level of cyanide too. So it's the same kind of thing, I think, where I believe a few would not be harmful to you, just like eating a few apple seeds. But I've heard like if you would eat like a pure cup of apple seeds, I mean that could be fatal, you know. So it's kind of a poison that would build up. So I don't believe a few that are broken, crushed, and release the cyanide would be that toxic.
And I think we do have a website on our extension website regarding that. So if you do a Google search, excuse me, not a Google search, but a web search on our University of Minnesota extension website page on choke cherries, I think you might find some information there. Thank you, Jeff. Chris also has a website on the chat on regarding elderberry toxicity. So he says it's not very toxic, but there's a website that he put up on the chat. So if you're interested in that, you can go to that. And then real quickly, Kate mentioned on elderberries too, dried elderberry flower infusion is delicious. Thank you, Kate.
Good. That sounds good. I'll have to try that. Thank you.
Next question, how many slash which of Minnesota ferns are edible?
That's interesting. And I've actually seen some different information on that. Which is okay, that's another reason that we do talk about. I'm going to go way back to that slide. Another reason we talk about using a few different references, they're not always going to agree. So for instance, the other one that's widely recognized as being edible will be bracken fern. And bracken fern, it does need to be boiled because it has an enzyme that will destroy some B vitamins in your body. And so, for instance, when cattle eat bracken fern uncooked, that is toxic to them. So, but this is one that's considered edible. And it's one you don't want to overconsume though, because there have been some reports coming out of Japan that with overconsumption, it can cause some types of cancer. But most of the other ones are really considered inedible. And I think where I've seen the different information is some sources will talk about them as being inedible enough to be toxic, and other references have just said, well, they don't taste good, so stay away from them. But either way, I would say stick to eating these two if you're going to be eating ferns and fiddleheads.
Yeah, and Jeff, I would recommend just stick to the ostrich fern. I've seen a lot of material, maybe it's more on livestock, but on the bracken fern being poisonous. So you want to be careful about that one. But you have a winter scene of the seed heads of the ostrich fern in your lower right-hand corner of your slide. So that's a indication right now. You could probably go out, unless you're 3 foot of snow, probably up there in Duluth, you can't find them. But yeah, not springtime before the fiddleheads come out. Obviously, that might be an indicator of the place where ostrich ferns are located. So that's a distinct recognition of their seed heads. But ostrich fern is really edible, and I'd say most any other fern is probably not. I'd say.
Yeah, stay away from them.
Yep. Kelly says on the cattail roots, I've heard that the cattail roots can be ground into flour for baking.
Excellent. I've heard that too.
A couple more comments in the chat that I'm not sure if you want to expand on at all. Somebody mentioned that all brambleberries are edible. And then the other comment is love pineapple weed and wood sorrel as well.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, we In this presentation, we just scratched the surface really on edible wild plants. Yes, I've eaten pineapple weed before. That's another introduced species, not a native species. And then the sorrels too are edible. So yeah, we've really just scratched the surface on edible wild plants in Minnesota.
He mentions the nettle tea is full of iron. And then Chris also says about the chokecherry, you can make chokecherry syrup.
Oh,
And then Lauren has a lot of our websites that she listed in there. Real quickly, Morgan mentioned missed last week's talk on windbreaks. Where can you find the presentation? All of our recordings are going to be on our Z link, z.umn.edu/Fridays. And I'll talk about that in our closing segment.
Okay, I got about 5 more questions in the Q&A.
Okay.
Do you have any experience with staghorn sumac? I hear you can make lemonade out of their pink fruit.
oh, I wish, I believe my dad is actually listening in today, and I wish we could unmute him. He could talk about this, but he made lemonade for us on several occasions, and it is really good. So this is the pinkish fruit of staghorn sumac, and you're catching it. This will be in the fall. So after it's flowered, it's gone to fruit, but it's a process of making lemonade for that. You do add quite a bit of sugar to it, like you do when you're making regular lemonade, but it's really quite good.
Yeah, and a few comments regarding the Sam Thayer books, and says that he writes about the plants that he has eaten, and they're great books. So you had that you had several books of Sam Thayer's in your resource list there.
Yeah, good. Thank you for that.
And he calls out some of the errors and misconceptions percepted by earlier works. So that's kind of an interesting books that Sam Thayer has written. Oh, finding wild asparagus and how to avoid picking buckthorn berries.
Is that a question, do you think, Gary, or comment?
A question of where to find wild asparagus, I suppose, is a question. And then how to avoid picking buckthorn berries. Buckthorn berries occur on the female plants of buckthorn. There's male and female plants of buckthorn. So certainly they're not going to be on every buckthorn tree. But yeah, just try and be aware of the buckthorn. Look on our website on buckthorn identification. You can scratch the bark. It looks orange, and it usually has thorns at the very tip of the branch. Not all branches, but very tip of the branch will have a thorn instead of a bud. But yeah, don't eat berries off buckthorn bushes, because it will give you a laxative effect, and you'll be running in the woods.
Yeah, well, thanks, Gary. Yeah, one. I think next time I give this presentation, I want to add some references on the poisonous plants in this area, because as well as learning about the edible wild plants, I think it's really important to learn the toxic ones and then learn to tell the difference. But there are actually some really good books on what are the poisonous plants in this area. So good point. I'm glad you brought that out. Wild asparagus, I don't know where to find that. I don't have any experience with that.
I know in rural Minnesota, we've actually seen it in my township ditches, actually, some places. So Casey mentions I live in the country on a gravel road. I have wild raspberry near the ditch. It is possible to dig up and transplant elsewhere, so it's not so close to the road and exposed to car exhaust. And I think that's a question. I'd say try it and go for it. Yeah, shouldn't be a problem.
Yeah.
Next question in Q&A, can you address corn smut?
It's an edible, Jeff, just so you know.
Okay, Doug, so I can't address that. Do you have much information on it, Gary?
Years ago, actually, it was a delicacy in Mexico and actually looked at as a possibility in southern United States. And I actually injected the spores into the ends of the ears of sweet corn in Whatwan County, St. James area, and actually got some to take. But yeah, at a certain stage, the very youthful stage of corn smut, it is an edible delicacy before it becomes a puffball and full of spores. So yeah, I'm sure you can do a Google search on it and find out more information. Yeah. Not too many people around in the corn growing area would eat corn smut though. Amy has, I have not been able to copy text in chat. Oh, okay. We may send that out along with the emails. We'll do that, but the Q&A you can, okay. I think the host has the option to allow. Could you please check? We'll check.
Yeah, we'll check on that.
Any more questions?
You had mentioned the corn smut in the puffball. That does remind me, one of the safer mushrooms to eat is the giant puffball. There are some lookalikes there, but giant puffball, you find that before it's gone to spores, those brown dusty spores. So you'd find it when it's still white and very firm, and that can be sliced up and fried. That's a good edible.
Chris mentions also Sam Thayer book, foragersharvest.com. And then also there's another website by Alan Burgo for recipes, foragechef.com. So that's some recommendations from Chris. Shane mentions choke cherry pits getting damaged to increase the cyanide risk. And then more or less the same risk as cherries. Poisoning is rare, Shane mentions.
Thanks, Shane.
Yep. Thank you for comments. Thank you all for your comments.
Another comment about corn smut. There's a restaurant in the Twin Cities that serves corn smut by another name, of course.
Okay.
And then another question for teas. What are the typical drying methods?
A good question. When I've made teas, typically I'm making them from the fresh plants. So I would say use the references or do some web searches to learn more about drying methods. I know like chaga, when I've made that tea, I've split the chaga up into 1/2-inch chunks, I'd say, and then just air dried it. And then store it in a sealed container. But yeah, typically when I'm making teas, I'm using the fresh. One tip I've really learned there, many of the pine and spruce trees make a very good, nutritious, high in vitamin C tea. But I've learned you don't put the needles in and then bring it to a boil. It's much better if you boil the water first, then put the leaves in and let it steep that way. And my favorite has been white spruce tea. It's really got a delicate flavor. It's really good.
Amy has a comment on the wild asparagus again. The mature plant is easy to find later in the season when they start to seed out and they're above the grass. So you can potentially mark your area or do a GPS maybe in that location, then come back next year in the spring and start picking. But obviously, depending on where you're foraging, of course, private versus public, et cetera, gather permission, unless it's on a township roadway or roadside, roadway right away. She also mentions a website there on wild asparagus out of the Iowa DNR.
Excellent, thank you.
Molly mentioned, or Mary has a comment on, if you eat the fiddleheads, the fern has less leaves, question mark. Is it possible to damage or kill the fern plant?
Yeah, I would say ostrich fern is one that you want to be careful not to over harvest. So on any one particular fern plant, you're going to want to make sure it's got several leaves that it can have for growing that upcoming season. So harvesting those fiddleheads, let's say an individual plant has maybe 6 fiddleheads coming up, just harvest like 2 of those from that plant. Leave the other 4 to continue growing so it'll photosynthesize and keep that individual plant alive. But very, very good point. Thank you.
Mhm. Any more questions, Lauren, for you?
Yes, I got 2 left in the Q&A. Oh, 3 left. Do you know any preparations for huckleberry fruits or any good resources that emphasize indigenous plant uses?
Yeah, we do have some good indigenous plant usage references, and I apologize for not putting those into the slide. So maybe we could include those in the follow-up material. Why don't we try and do that? Huckleberry is one I'm not familiar with. I'm wondering if it could be a common name that I know it by something else.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that too. I think it's more of maybe a southern variety. Rebecca has a comment here. Are sweet ferns edible or usable? Sweet ferns. Not sure.
Yeah, there is, and here again, we're going to get into where the common name could be a little bit different, but there is a sweet fern that makes a very good tea.
Mm.
So you'd want to, check a reference book, make sure you're looking at the correct, because we, could be using a different common name. But there is a sweet fern that's known for making a very pleasant tasting tea. So good comment.
Shane also mentions moon seed. I see a bunch of poisonous look-alike to wild grapes as well. Moon seed. Thank you, Shane. I'm not familiar with that plant.
Yeah, Canada moonseed is another common name, but that's one of the 3 poisonous lookalikes for wild grape. So thank you, Shane. I think that's more common in the southern part of the state.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Chris has. Oh, go ahead, Lauren.
Next question in Q&A. Does it matter if cattails are native, invasive, or hybrid?
It does not. In terms of edibility, it does not. And I checked a few references on that. So those are, so it's the narrow-leaved cattail that's invasive, and it is causing a lot of problems, ecology problems in wetlands across the state. And then that will hybridize with the native cattail. But from what I've read in terms of edibility, they both have an equal edibility, including the hybrids. So no concerns there.
Chris has another comment on the cattails. Make sure it's the cattail root that you're picking up and not something else out of the wetland.
Good.
Shane mentions too, lily of the valley or ramps, poisonous lookalikes.
Yeah. Oh, excellent. That one, the leaves look a lot like it. Yes.
And I got one more question in the Q&A. Wild asparagus, isn't this introduced and an escapee from our garden similar to garlic mustard?
I believe it is. As we've had this discussion about wild asparagus, I do remember finding that near railroad tracks now. And that, yes, that was a garden escapee. I don't think it's ecologically destructive from what I know. It doesn't reproduce like crazy like a garlic mustard would, but I do believe that is an escapee from gardens.
Just a few comments on corn smut again. Let's see, you had corn smut in Mexico. It was delicious. And then also another comment, some people some rare people farming corn spot, and it's very delicate and difficult to ship. So just a few things on corn spot. There you go.
I've learned a lot today about corn smut. Thank you for the comments.
Let's see. Any more questions you have, Lauren? I got a ton of more, I think, comments. Maybe you want to come and help me on that. Let's see. Christopher Hobbs is the best strategy for processing chaga. Hackberry. Hackberry, I think, has a star on it. I'm not sure. Hackberry seeds are edible, I think I've heard. Maybe that's, and thank you. Thank you.
That's accurate.
That person. Another foragerchef.com, Hackberry. Okay, you can find that there. Let's see. Thanks. Yep, from Shane, and thanks for Jack. Let's see. Let's see. Should we call it feral? Is that pronounced right? Feral asparagus. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think they did come from somewhere, but I imagine the seeds might have been eaten by birds and spread that way, just like buckthorn. So I'm not sure how the asparagus gets to where they are. I think I'm done with the chat now.
I know, Gary, you had a few closing comments too about those workshops. So I'll stop my share.
Let me get to that, please. Yes. Yeah. Jeff, is that full screen, or Lauren, is that full screen?
Yep.
Yeah, we want to thank Jeff for today's presentation, Foraging with Wild Edibles. And we have a few more slides here. We just wanted to mention too that we have a spring and a fall Foraging with Minnesota Harvester Handbook series with our local extension educators around the state. So this is a Z-link, z.umn.edu/wildforaging. And we're going to collect $20 at the door, and you get a free book. How about that? Of course, it's not free, it's $20, right? But we are going to talk about foraging in those locations around the state. And obviously, we have various locations of edibles and decoratives around the state. So that please note that. And we'll have some fall series in September in our southern part of the state. I know southeastern part of the state will have some meetings in the September time period. So we do have some more Fridays with a Forester, and you could participate with that. And then also there'll be a short evaluation as you leave today's webinar, and all of our recordings are recorded at z.umn.edu/Fridays. We've had a lot of comments asking if these are being recorded. They are. So you can find out you can view the recordings that we've had previously, and actually last year's recordings as well, at that Z-link, z.umn.edu/Fridays. And then also, if you're not getting the My Minnesota Woods email newsletter once a week or once a month, then you can Z-link that website there as well, My Minnesota Woods, and find out more information and sign up for that. And thank you for joining us. Thank you, Jeff and Lauren and Rose, and for monitoring the web and for presenting on wild edibles today. Appreciate it. Very good. Thank you for joining us, everyone.